Okay, so scope is the lifetime invisibility of variables and functions within a class. Scope can describe either public or private variables and functions and is often confused with class descriptors like public and private. Now, I want you to understand a couple of things about this. You can create a property, as the technical term, that is basically used as a variable, but that particular variable really, it could be public, it could be private, but typically if you are programming properly, when we say for each string s in some collection, we don't want to confuse that s is anything more than a variable. It's not a property. It's not something that has anything really to do with the class. It's just something that we're using as a programming construct to represent some particular variable. A variable is very, very similar to a property. The only thing is, when we say property, we're saying this is relevant in some way to the class. Even if it's a private property, a private property simply means that it can't be seen outside of the class, but it's still relevant in some way to the class itself. It is not something that you're just randomly throwing into a for loop or something like that to maintain a count. Okay, so the difference is, you would say, can the class as a whole do without this particular property? The yes or no is going to depend a lot on what it does. Methods are very specific. Generally speaking, they are private, but not completely. There's usually a method or two that the class exposes to other classes to be utilized as a external value that you're going to utilize. So let's take this to a kind of a real world thing. Let's say that you go into a restaurant, you sit down in a booth, a server comes over to you, and they ask you what you want to order. Okay, so you place your order with the server. The server goes back to the kitchen and places your order in, maybe just clips your order on a little roundabout thing, and the kitchen staff takes over and cooks the meal and so forth and so on. The server may go to a machine to get you coffee, tea, or some kind of soda or whatever, or just water, and then he, she, whatever will bring you, that server will bring you your drinks, and then when the meal is ready, the server will go back to the kitchen staff and get the meal and bring it to you and serve you your meal. Okay, the only persons that you could possibly interact with in that particular scenario are your server and probably your restaurant manager in that particular case, or possibly a separate person that you would pay your bill with. Okay, so you would not really interact with anybody else. You wouldn't interact with the kitchen staff. You wouldn't interact with the people who are responsible for cleaning up back in the kitchen or anything of that nature. The only people you would interact with are your server, possibly the manager if there was a problem with your food, or even if there wasn't, something like that. So the idea of the class is that you are limiting the interactability with other classes. Whereas with scope, scope has to do with the inside things, the things that are simply meant to improve the small details that don't really have anything to do with the class. They have everything to do with the individual statements within the class. And when we're talking about lifetime invisibility, some of those are only alive, if you will, the lifetime. They only exist for a brief moment and then they shut down. They no longer need to exist. The visibility, they might exist within a single method or a single function, and then when that function or that method is completed, they cease to exist. You can create variables that are visible throughout the entire class, but only exist for the duration of the class. That is, once the class is instantiated, they are created, and then once the class object is destroyed, then the variables no longer exist as well. Okay, so, and this is not to be confused again with the properties and methods. Yes, whenever we instantiate an object, we do create the properties and methods, but they are slightly different in as much that they are relevant specifically to the instantiation, and they are specifically related to the class itself. What can be seen, what can't be seen, and what object items are being utilized as a result of calling some particular aspect of the class. Now, in encapsulation, again, we're talking about the lifetime invisibility outside of the class. So whether that means we are directly instantiating an object and then those particular items are available, or whether we are inheriting them. Okay, so if we inherit a particular class from another class. Okay, so let's say that we're talking about class 1, and then class 1 is inheriting everything from class 2. But we don't inherit everything. We inherit only public items. Okay, so anything that is public in class 2 is inherited into class 1, and then if class 1 is instantiated on another class, then that instantiation automatically instantiates onto the other items, and all of those public items that are visible in class 1 are also visible, within class 2. So all of those items, as you'll see in a minute, are visible for wherever it is instantiated. Okay, so a quick slide here, and then we're done for the theory. Imagine that class 2, which is over on the left, had a couple of methods, T1 and T2, plus a method which was T3, but was only visible within class 2 because it is private, you'll notice. If we create class 1 and it inherits from class 2, we have every public item from class 2, which includes T1 and T2, and we also added another method in class 2 that, or class 1 rather, that is a method called public T4. And of course, as I said before, this is a derived class, so it also includes T1 and T2 if we instantiate class 1. So over on the thing that I call form 1, at the very top there I'm instantiating class 1 C1, which is the variable, and I'm saying that C1 is going to be a new instantiated object of class 1. So if we want to get to any of these methods, you can see that we can say C1 dot T1, that gets to the T1 method. Even though that's in class 2, it is inherited in class 1, so we can still get to it. And if we want to get to T2, the same thing. C1 dot T2, again, class 2 is inherited by class 1, so when we instantiated class 1, it also automatically collected items from the class 2 item. And then C1.T4 class 1 will automatically, of course, be instantiated, and as that, it will be picking up T4. So this is the end of the theory. I want to point out a few other things when it comes to the tasks specifically this particular week. Just quickly, we often talk about the security of the items, but in reality, what we're talking about is security of programming doesn't necessarily directly mean security of data in particular. Security of data is something which you programmatically handle through encryption, through procedures, and so on and so forth. Whether we declare something public or private really isn't going to necessarily guarantee privacy and or security of data itself. Okay, that's something which we need to handle within our programming procedures that we do when we create a particular project or program. Please don't confuse the privacy that we talk about in real life with the privacy of variables, properties, and methods in a object-oriented language. They're apples and oranges. They're just two different things.